Welcome to Workplace Psychology with Dr. Martha Greidick. I'm Dr. Martha Greidick. This podcast examines a wide variety of work-related issues through the lens of industrial and organizational psychology. And while many of the topics discussed here may be seen as intended for white-collar employees and their employers, in reality, the ideas presented here are applicable across organizations and industries. Additionally, many of the topics discussed here may be applicable outside of the workplace. I encourage you to examine what's presented here, apply what makes sense to you, and simply discard the rest. It's no secret that the landscape of work is changing, and that includes both the workplace and the workforce. While some companies have insisted that their employees return to the office, other companies allow their workers to work either remotely on a full-time basis or remotely in a hybrid type of arrangement. As we're experiencing this change that's related to work and how we all work, it's important to remember that this is new for all of us. So essentially, we're all learning as we go along. With change come both benefits and difficulties at times. As we consider the new ways of working and experiencing the workplace remotely, it's very important that organizations pay attention to those individuals who work remotely. It's all too easy to forget about them because, let's face it, out of sight, out of mind is a real thing. In other words, it's absolutely critical that remote employees do not find themselves isolated from an organization. Of course, this is very different from things such as micromanagement or constant or frequent interruptions which prevent an employee from doing his or her work. So those are very different ideas. The idea here is that an organization needs to be in touch with a remote employee and aware of what's going on with that employee so that the concept or that the danger of an employee becoming isolated from that organization are decreased as much as possible, hopefully eliminated altogether. Being able to work remotely has been a very attractive option for many employees, and for some, it has become an absolute necessity. What is important to remember is that sometimes people don't realize that remote work could lead to things such as being disconnected or even isolated from their employing organization or company. It's all too easy to look at the benefits and never consider what kind of negatives or challenges one may face in this kind of working arrangement. Awareness and being proactive are key. When we talk about the possibility of feeling isolated as a remote employee, the responsibility falls on both sides, both the employee and the employer. But I will say that the employer has the majority of the responsibility in terms of being proactive to make sure that this is not likely to happen or to prevent it from happening altogether. There are some relatively simple things that an employer can do in order to engage remote employees so that they don't fall into that category of being isolated and separated from the company. things such as virtual meetings can be a very good start because it allows everybody to connect with one another, even if it's done virtually. In-person meetings are another good option. So even for those employees who work remotely on a regular basis, having periodically an in-person kind of meeting for everybody is a good idea. This could be something that happens once a month or even once a quarter, but it's a good start of getting everybody together so that people who work remotely aren't completely isolated from the rest of the team. Organizing other in-person events, whether it's company events or social events, is something that a company can also do as a way of bringing people together in person and preventing those who work remotely from being isolated from the rest of the company. Similarly, things such as professional conferences or professional events or expos of any kind are a good way of bringing people together. It doesn't mean that it has to happen on the company's premises, but it's still a good way of connecting people in person. The bottom line is that an employer has the responsibility of being aware of what's going on with their workforce. They have to have their finger on the proverbial pulse, if you will. An organization absolutely needs to know what's going on with their employees. And while that's not to say that any organization can have complete knowledge and all the information in terms of what's going on with their workforce, that's not to say that the responsibility isn't there. The responsibility still remains for the company, for the organization, to be as engaged and involved and as aware as possible in terms of what's going on with their employees. In other words, it's up to the organization to have ongoing and regular engagement with their employees so that the organization may understand basic things such as morale or the general mood of their employees, their workforce. This translates into simply being able to gather data. This may be done through informal conversations or through surveys and things that are a little more formal, or a combination of both. Whatever it takes to get some real-time, real data so that an organization can have a good understanding of what is going on with their employees. An organization should look at things such as employee behaviors and attitudes and engagement and productivity. All of those things can be very telling in terms of what's going on with the workforce in general, as a group, as a collective, as well as within each individual. And while some may think that ignorance is bliss, and sometimes it can be, there's no room for that here. An organization has the responsibility of understanding as much as possible in terms of what's going on with their employees. Only then can they be proactive in preventing things such as remote employee isolation. As I've mentioned earlier, while I stress the responsibility for the employer, everybody engaged shares in this responsibility. That means that individual employees must also understand their own behaviors, attitudes, engagement level, and productivity. And they have to be able to determine if there are any changes within those things, within those parameters. Because if there are changes in an individual's behaviors or attitudes or engagement or productivity, it's up to that individual to, one, recognize these changes, but also to communicate with the employer. If the individual recognizes changes within themselves and is able to identify that he or she may be experiencing a case of isolation or separation from the organization, It's critical that they're able to communicate that with the organization so that appropriate steps can be taken in order to reverse the situation and improve their workplace experience, even though they're working remotely. As this episode comes to an end, let's review what was discussed. As the landscape of work changes, that means both in terms of the workplace and the employee or the workforce, it is important that we're all on the same page in terms of change can be difficult. Sometimes it can be positive, sometimes it can be challenging, but we're all learning as we go. It's especially important to make sure that we're paying attention to remote employees so that they don't find themselves separated from the company or isolated from the company. And while the responsibility belongs to everybody on this topic, I strongly suggest that companies must absolutely take the reins here and be as proactive as possible in engaging their workforce collectively and individually to ensure that remote employee isolation is prevented. Companies can engage with things such as in-person events, be that events that are company related or social in nature, on-site or off-site. It's also important that there's ongoing and open communication so that an organization understands what is going on with their employees in terms of morale, general mood, and also things such as behaviors and attitudes, productivity, and engagement. It's also important to remember that each individual must understand those very things within themselves and be able to pinpoint changes. Once you identify changes in your productivity and engagement and attitude and mood as it relates to your work and your employer, it's important to be able to communicate that with your employer so that steps can be taken to correct any feelings of separation and isolation from the organization. As the week unfolds, I invite you to take stock of what's going on within your own organization. If you are the business owner, take a look at any of your employees who are working remotely, whether that's on a full-time basis or in a hybrid type of arrangement, and evaluate whether or not any of them are separated and isolated. And of course, the best way to do that is through open and ongoing communication so that you have a good understanding of what's going on with your workforce, both collectively and on an individual level. And if you're an individual employee, I encourage you to do the same thing and consider how, if you are a remote worker, remote work is affecting you. Are you potentially feeling separated or isolated from your employer, or are you heading there? It's so important that you understand your own behaviors and attitudes and notice any change that may happen over time. And as I've already mentioned, communication is key. So if you do notice changes within yourself as an individual employee, it's important that you communicate that with your employer. For those of you who are experiencing this podcast in an audio-only version, I invite you to check out my YouTube channel where you can experience the podcast in a video version as well. In addition to the podcast, there are many other videos that focus on stress management. So I highly encourage you to check out my YouTube channel at the link that's included in the description below. Thank you for joining me today. Please subscribe to this podcast. I look forward to seeing you again next time. Until then, I wish you joy and well-being.